Hey class, today we're going to take up what are called argument diagrams. These are diagrams of the logical structure of arguments. It's going to be, pictorial as we're going to go on to see, or, at least involve, arrows showing the direction of support, things like that. Before we get started on that though, I just wanted to, discuss something with you on an intuitive level. So take these two arguments here. There's going to be two different ways which these arguments provide support to the conclusion. Okay, so let's take the first one. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Socrates is mortal. Now you notice that these two premises together have to stay together in order to provide support to this conclusion. If you were to take one of these premises out of it and then try to get the conclusion from the remaining premise, it wouldn't work, right? So if we removed this premise here, Socrates is a human, Socrates is mortal, therefore. That wouldn't work because the alien who would consider this argument here wouldn't know anything about humans. He wouldn't know that humans are mortal. For all the alien knows, they are immortal. So that wouldn't work. So what we have in this kind of argument here are premises that are dependent, and that means they have to stay together. Each of them depends on one another in order to provide support to the conclusion. So, premises might provide support dependently to a conclusion. Now, if we consider this second argument, we are going to see that the premises here are independent. You can remove one from the argument, leave the remaining premise, and it's still providing support to the conclusion. So, first premise, getting an education broadens your horizon. Second premise, getting an education will also increase your lifetime income. Therefore, you should get an education. Okay, so those two premises are providing support to this conclusion. It's one argument, but they're doing so in a way that is independent of one another, so that if you remove one of these premises, right, the remainder is going to be providing, the same kind of logical support, without that premise. As with it, right? So, so it's providing independent support. So the second argument had independent premises that were, a part of it. And so those kinds of, fine-grained, logical relations are what argument diagrams allow us to do. We're going to be given the tools in this chapter to be able to see those kinds of different supports, and to draw a diagram which captures that specific type of logical relationship. Okay, so then let's go into the PowerPoint, and an argument diagram is a visual representation of the structure of an argument. What we're going to get, just to give you an example here, we're going to sketch some out here in just a second. But the first argument that had all humans are mortal, that was one premise, and then you had a second premise plus two, Socrates is mortal, was giving support to the third premise 3. The plus here is going to indicate that it is that they are dependent premises. They need to go together. Okay, so 1 plus 2 together provide support to the conclusion. In the other one, you had, just a 1 providing, the first premise was providing support to the conclusion, as was the other one. So, they were, and they're not tied together, right? You don't tie them together as being dependent premises with the plus sign. The fact that, that they're diagrammed out in this way would indicate that they are independent premises. Okay, so we're going to use a method, to do this. It is a 5-step method, right? And, first we're going to take the passage, and do some underlining. we're going to number the statements, right? So, and then, draw an underline under the indicator words. Since, therefore, and because are all indicator words. We'll take a couple passages here in a second to do this. But right now, let's just present the 5 steps here. So in step 2, you'll want to find the conclusion and draw a wavy line under it. Number 3, locate the premises and underline them. 4, cross out all extraneous material. That would be any material that is redundant, irrelevant, right? Things that are non-statements like questions and exclamations. And then you're going to draw the diagram, connecting premises and conclusions with arrows showing logical connections. And, we're going to have ways of capturing, the fact that premises are either dependent or independent. Okay, so now, how do you determine whether a premise is dependent? So, I just sort of walked you, through the sort of reasoning you're going to do to make that determination. It's actually like a test, right? So, if there's a premise that offers support to a conclusion without the help of any other premises, then it is independent. And you can, apply this test. You can isolate a premise and ask, does the premise support the conclusion? Does the support to the conclusion change when the other premises are removed? So remember, I tried to remove one of the premises from that argument, involving Socrates, the support does change, right? You lose the support actually for the conclusion. So so you can't do it, right? As opposed to the second argument where I removed one of the premises, right? And then the remaining ones still provided support to the conclusion in an untarnished way. And so that means that it's an independent premise. Okay, so, the dependent premises are jointly providing support to the conclusion, just to sort of reiterate. And if you remove one, then the support of the other remaining one is canceled out or diminished, right? It's just, the support is, the support takes a hit whenever you remove it, right? It makes it less. Okay, so here's, let's try this example here. We're going to start out, with some simple arguments to do this. So I'll walk you through this one here. So here's an argument that says, here are some reasons why you should stop smoking cigarettes. Smoking is addictive and it is bad for your health, right? So, remember we were doing this underlining, right? The conclusion here is, you should just, these little steps that you have to take aren't really all that important. I just want to, draw attention to the conclusion. That's the conclusion. I'm trying to draw a wavy line here and I really can't, sorry. So we're going to number the statements, right? That's going to be number 1. And then, the premises, you have one statement here, number 2. And then you have, the third statement, which is number 3. Okay, and we don't have any indicator words or anything like that. Okay, so the whole phrase is an indicator word now that I think about it. So here are some reasons, right, that would indicate that, the conclusion is about to be stated, and then the reasons are going to follow. So you should stop smoking cigarettes is the conclusion. And now when you diagram this out, you want to put the conclusion on the bottom, always. And then you ask, are these dependent or independent premises? Now, what you do is you apply the test here, right? If you were to remove one of the premises and then, take the remaining one and ask, okay, does it provide support to the conclusion, in an undiminished way? If the answer to that is yes, then, you would ascertain that it's a independent premise. So what you have here are independent premises actually, right? So, smoking is addictive, that one, on its own, establishes, that you shouldn't smoke. Nobody wants to be addicted, right? And then number 3, it's also bad. Smoking is also bad for your health. Right? So you got a couple of independent premises here. And that they are independent, is shown by the fact that you don't have any, plus, you don't have a plus, connecting here. Okay. Um, so, okay, so then let's take up, um, okay, so then let's take up the next argument. Actually, wait, let me see. So here is an account of the work that that I just did here, and now we'll move on to the next one. We have an argument which states you are pregnant and smoking while pregnant could hurt the fetus. Therefore, you should stop smoking cigarettes. Right. So you have a conclusion indicator here, right? And therefore, so that marks out the conclusion for you. When you do these argument diagrams and you're looking at arguments, these indicator words are going to be all important because these are very simple, and you can easily, decipher what conclusion is, but in other cases you can't, right? It's a little bit more difficult. So, so that therefore is going to help us to, know that this statement, whatever number it is going to be on the bottom, right? The arrows are going to be pointing to it. So you have, another statement, you are pregnant, and you have it conjoined to this other statement, smoking while pregnant could hurt the fetus. So, okay, so 1, 2, 3, you have 3 statements. Now, this first sentence, right, it's one sentence, right? Grammatically, it's one sentence, right? It's a conjunction, right? But it has 2 statements, right? So it's a compound statement. So you have to, break that down into its simplest statements. That's sort of the rule of thumb, you should abide by it because, analysis, is a matter of, resolving compounds, into their components, their basic elements, right? So if you're analyzing, a passage, you should be able to sort of see, the very basic, constituents of passage instead of keeping them together. Okay. So, so we have 3 statements here. So 3 is going to be the one that receives the support. Now the question is, you have 1 and 2, right? And how are we going to diagram 1 and 2 as dependent or independent premises? You are pregnant, right? So do the isolation test. If you were to have just 1, right, would that, provide support to 2 or to 3 rather? The answer, you might think the answer to that is yes, but, that's because you're not thinking in the way that an alien would think. Right? You want to, sort of just see, whatever information is given by the passage itself, right? Not all the background information that you have. Okay. So you're pregnant. The alien says, okay, yeah, I'm pregnant. Does that provide support to the idea that you stop smoking cigarettes? Well, not of itself, right? You also need this other statement, right? And this other one, sort of when you think about it, it's directly tied to, the pregnancy. So smoking while pregnant could hurt the fetus. Now, can 2 do the isolation test on 2? Can 2 provide support to 3 on its own? Smoking while pregnant could hurt the fetus. You should stop smoking cigarettes. Okay, well, suppose that argument is given to me. I'm not pregnant, right? So it's true that 2, smoking, while pregnant hurts the fetus. I shouldn't stop smoking cigarettes, though, for that reason, because I'm not pregnant. So 2, is dependent on 1, and 1 is dependent on 2. So you're going to write that out like this. The one thing I didn't do before was draw an underline under it. So draw an underline under it, and pluses in between the premises, and that would indicate that this is a set of independent premises, as is captured by the next slide here. Okay, now let's try to diagram this argument out. Felipe ought to try out for wrestling since he's both strong and quick. That's what I would do if I were him. Now, what's the conclusion here? Well, this sense right here is going to indicate, the premises. So the premises are going to be, he is both strong and he is quick. Okay. So we're going to keep that statement together, right? Because of the particular form of it. Now, what I said about, breaking it down to its most basic elements, that's a rule of thumb, and I suggest it as a rule of thumb because, analysis, tends towards, resolution of more complicated elements into their more basic elements. But, strictly speaking, if you keep them together, right? Like if we were to keep, this statement, since he is both strong and quick, together as one, you could, take it together as one, or you could separate it out. He is both strong and he is both quick. Strictly speaking, it wouldn't be incorrect, okay? But so given it the way that this is sort of structured, I'm going to just leave it as one. And let's see, so we have one statement here, and this is actually the conclusion. Now this over here, what is this doing? That's what I would do if I were him. This is doing nothing, right? It's extraneous to the argument. The conclusion is Felipe ought to try out for wrestling. The support for that is that he is both strong and quick. So if you keep these two together, then you're going to have, this diagram here. 1, 2. Alternatively, you can also, break, you could break this down into two statements. Let's see. Okay, so say I were to do it this way. He is both strong. Whoops. Okay, so he is both strong. That's one statement, and he is quick. You would write it out this way. Let's see. I think, yeah, you need both in order to be a good wrestler, right? I mean, strength on its own is not going to do it. Neither is quickness on its own. You also need strength. So they need to complement one another. So it would be like this, if you were to separate them out. Okay. So let's see what we presented here. Yeah, there was, and actually I have these in the reverse order. My apologies. This should be the conclusion, so it should be the other way around. Let me, sometimes when you're working too quickly, that happens. So you gotta be careful there. That's the N3 is an extra claim, as I mentioned. So you can leave it out of the argument diagram. Any extraneous material is not going to be included in the diagram of the argument. Okay, so let's try this one out. Since Reggie Bush was injured last week, he won't be able to play in the next game. This means that Chris Ivory will be the Saints' starting running back. So look, what we have here is another type of support. This is what's called like a horizontal sequence. So this is a premise here, right? Since Reggie was injured last week, he won't be able to play in the next game, right? So this is providing support to this over here. He won't be able to play in the next game, right? So that's, there's two statements there. Let's go ahead and denote those as 1 and 2. And then there's a third one here. Chris Ivory, this means that Chris Ivory will be the Saints starting running back. So that's 3. Now this, this is another conclusion indicator actually, right? So it's saying because of, what came before, what preceded, it follows that Chris Ivory will be the Saints starting running back. So you would put the conclusion there, and then, what you want to do is look. You had to make a choice here. You might say, well, you might think, well, why don't we do, why don't we do it this way? 1 plus 2, leads to 3. The problem with that is that you have a conclusion indicator saying this is a premise and this is a conclusion. So you're actually, so you're missing something in this diagram here, which is captured by the indicator words, right? So the sense is going to be providing support to 2, okay? So this premise is a premise for a conclusion 2. And then, this is saying, well, that 2 is actually providing support to 3. So hence the horizontal, sequence here, right? You have a premise providing support to a conclusion, and then you have conclusion, which is, serving as a premise in an argument for another conclusion. Okay, so it's a sort of extended argument, right? And we get these all the time, in the real world, and they're very, very complicated. I mean, if you were to try to read, an article in the New Yorker, there's some very, very complicated, high-level stuff in there. But and just being your basic newspaper, right? I mean, you'll have extended arguments, right, where you have the establishment of one conclusion by a set of premises, and then then you go on, to infer further things, on the basis of the conclusions. So they stand as premises for further conclusions, and then so on. So that's you have something in a simplified form here. It's a simplified case. This more extended kind of argument. Okay, so let's see, and that is captures what I just said here. And now I'm going to actually work with you on some of these, and let me bring up the homework. Okay, so what I have on the shared screen here is the homework that you have to do. You only have to do 1 through 15, by the way. This includes, more than 15. It includes, like 10 more. So I only want you to do 1 through 15. So let's take some of the starred ones, right? So number 6 is starred, which, by the way, you don't have to do, in your homework. I mentioned that, in the directions, you do 1 through 15, and don't do the starred ones, which is number 6 and number 10. So let's try to do the argument diagram for this one here. Okay, so number 6, we have, if Marla buys a house in suburbs, she will be happier and healthier. She is buying the house in the suburbs, so she will be happier and healthier. So this is a conclusion indicator, right? So this is going to be your conclusion. And then you have one premise. So that's number 1. And then you have your second premise. She is buying the house in the suburbs. Now, if you have a decent memory, you're going to recall our argument patterns, in the previous section. And this is actually an example of a modus ponens, right? An affirmation of the antecedent. So now what you would do is these are going to be dependent premises. How do you know that? Well, because, if you were to try to remove one and then get the argument, it won't work, right? If you try to remove one and get the conclusion, it won't work. So if you try to do it with one only, right? If Marla buys a house in the suburbs, she will be happier and healthier. Conclusion, she will be happier and healthier, right? No, the conclusion doesn't follow from that premise alone. Now, take, the second premise alone, she is buying the house in the suburbs. Therefore, Marla will be happier and healthier. That conclusion doesn't follow from that premise either, right? So it's both 1 and 2 together that will lead to the conclusion, and you're going to diagram that out in this way. I forgot to mark this as a 3. So that would be your argument diagram for number 6. Okay, now let's take number 10. The existence of planets outside our solar system is a myth. There is no reliable empirical evidence at all showing that planets exist outside our solar system. So here you have an argument with 2 premises, with 2 statements. And, so there's 1 and 2. Now the question is, which one is the conclusion? You don't get any help with the indicator words in this one, right? So you're just going to have to read it, and then you ask, okay, what is the main point of this passage? What is it trying to get at here? So it's going to be number 1, that it's a conclusion, right? It's trying to argue that the existence of planets outside our solar system is a myth. And what's the evidence or the reasons for that? Well, there's no evidence, for it. That's the evidence, right? The lack of evidence. So, so then you would just, draw this out in this way. 2 is providing support to 1. Okay. Okay, so I hope this helped. One of the things that you really want to um, keep in mind as you're working through this is that this concept of a dependent and independent premise is going to be central to the argument construction assignment, which is going to come up next. In these argument construction assignments, I'm going to ask you to select a conclusion and then come up with two independent reasons for for that conclusion, supporting that conclusion. So you're going to have to know the distinction between a dependent and independent premise in order to be able to do that assignment properly. So make sure that you understand this stuff, okay? Dependent and the distinction between independent and dependent premises. Okay?